just the idea that these are some of the biggest cities that ever existed, and many of them are built informally by the people. Next. Yes, following. Next. And there are very good aspects that we could consider of sustainable development. They're compact, low energy, made by the people, and so on. But they're always at the urban fringe, lacking infrastructure, public spaces, community services, and this translates into spatial and social segregation, and in many times violence. Next. This is only aggravated by the environmental crisis, as has mentioned before. Go ahead, please. We've seen migrations due to climate change, desertification. Next. Enhancing social tension and conflict. Next. And of course, we've seen the effects of COVID, how it has a stronger incidence in the most vulnerable communities. Next. Latin America is still considered the context with the strongest social inequalities, and a very high percentage of the population already lives in informal settlements. These are not marginal communities. It is the mainstream. The majority of the population lives in this type of urbanism. Next. I had modified the presentation, so I'm sorry about that. Let's go ahead. Go ahead, please. Next. Okay, when I was national director of planning in Venezuela, we realized that the conventional planning that we were making ignored more than half of the population. I will explain. Here you see in the colored, in the center, all the planning ideas of urban design, the public spaces, the block typology, the building typology, the landscape typology. And as soon as we approved the plan, rural land became urban land. And for the population of less resources, they could not access the real estate market. Thus, the only way that they could come into the city was to build their homes, as you see in the white polygons, out of the urban area, exactly in the areas that the plan said that they were inadequate for urbanization. Next, please. We've tried to solve the problem through public housing, but the truth is that in most developing countries, the demand for housing is always larger than the availability of housing, even in the richer countries. And the other thing that is very important to take into consideration is that look at these images at the right. This is a consolidated informal settlement. It's a living machine that grows, that is flexible, that can incorporate shops to the growing family. None of this happens in conventional social housing. Next, please. While I was in government, we pushed ahead the plans to deal with the improvement of the existing informal settlements. We were dealing with aspects, let's say, of a metropolitan, of a territorial equality, like for instance, the area that you see in red are the areas that are geologically unstable. These areas required relocation of the population. Those that are in yellow, maybe they're incomplete, they lack infrastructure, public space, but they're stable. So this was the first information that we had. And then the images on the right, we see more site-specific urban design interventions dealing with the provision of public space and services in these communities. Next. Something extremely important that I would like to mention in this slide is that when you have an area that it is geologically unstable, high risk prone for several reasons, but it's not an area adequate, you have to associate them with uses that the community engages with, community gardens, sport areas, because if you don't, these areas will be eventually reoccupied, reinvaded, and you lose your efforts. Next, please. Perhaps the most well-known of all these examples of improving the informal settlements is the city of Medellin in Colombia, which was for many years the most dangerous city in the planet. But these operations, if they're carried out in a holistic manner, well, they have amazing results, reducing violence, increasing local economies. And to do this, of course, to create the public space and to take people out of areas of risk, you need relocation housing, as you see in the image on the left. But it is very difficult to find place to relocate people because these areas are so dense. Next, please. These plans to improve the informal settlements are very beneficial, but they operate well at a local scale, at a neighborhood scale. But most of the services, the universities, the markets, the government centers, the culture, the sport facilities, the hospitals, and most of the jobs are located in the formal city. So there's a limit that you can do with this type of urban surgery. Next, please. So this is the big challenge ahead. The population in informal settlements is expected to double in the next 20 years to 2 billion people. That is crazy. And I would insist that housing is not the problem. It is the lack of what I've called the urban armature or the landscape armature or support system. And these are the essence or the concept of my research that stems from education, research, professional practice in the public and in the private sector, and of course the work with the students. And it's expressed in these books. Now, what does the approach say? That we should work in a preemptive way over the land before occupation occurs. I always say that it is easier to work with a child and to assist them, to guide them, to help them through life than to try to correct the vices of a serial killer at age 100. It's supposed to work in a multi-scalar way from the territorial to the specific. This support has to do with the physical, but also with the performative, with the emotional. The effort is concentrated in the public space, in the public realm, not in the housing. Something extremely important, urban designers and planners and architects usually try to control everything. Here, the approach suggests to control only the aspects that are relevant and to be very selective of these aspects that will vary from one context to the other. And taking us to the theme of this of the panel, this is not an urbanism that is static. It is transformative as the informal sector always is. And something, keep in mind, how do we secure the spatial requirements to cope with the transformations, with the changing demands? I will try to explain this through examples. Like all design or approaches, usually you rely on a system of design components. In the Roman city, the Cardon, the Decumano, the Agora, in the colonial city in America, La Piazza, il Comune. So it's a system that simplifies how you pass from a theory to how you affect the territory. And I've suggested these three categories of components. One that I've called corridors, which you see are like these elongated adaptive systems. They're the framework, they're the skeleton of the system. Then you have these like calda stables, they look like fegatos, like organs, that some of them have dots and some do not. Those with the puntini are those land that is made available to facilitate the self-constructed process. And those that do not have the dots are the uses that any city aspires to have. Parks, hospitals, schools, whatever, that never appear spontaneously in the informal city. And therefore is one of the reasons that they're in great social disadvantage. And finally, you have these little dots that have influence to our territory, which in Italian we call them the custodis. In English, I call them the stewards. These are like giardinieri that keep an eye in the transformation of the corridors and of the fields, of the patches of the campi. Let's go. So let's say that the image we see here on the left is the tip of an informal settlement. And we know that over time, this entire territory will be covered of informal settlements. What is the thing that we should do first? Well, to try to identify those aspects that should be protected. And which are there? The streams, the flood areas, the rich agricultural soils. This is what Ian McHarg would do. Now, if we are in Germany and we say this is protected, vietato, no one goes in. But in the developing world, these areas will be immediately occupied if they're not associated with uses that are relevant to the community, as you see in the images on the right. Next. So while the previous ones try to protect, these corridors, these attractor corridors, try to bring people to the areas convenient for urbanization, and they connect, they extract the energy of the existing informal settlements. And along this line, we will probably have the transportation systems, the best community spaces, the facilities, the economic drivers, and so on. It will vary in each country. Like say, if we're in a country like Zimbabwe, in the capital, Harare, where only 80% of the population have potable water, and the rest has to take the water from wells that are contaminated by fecal material, and they have cholera. If along this line in Harare, you place a potable water, you would have people attracted. So again, it depends in each country. I always say that in Brazil, you put 5 football courts and you have 1 million Brazilians along this pink line. Let's go ahead, please. Now, let's say that in this pink line is we have the transportation system. But we cannot build a rickshaw system, a BRT bus, or a light rail when there's no population. So how do you secure the spatial requirements for this pink line? Let's say that in early phases, what we have is an agricultural school that has 3 kilometers long by 200 meters wide, and it's fenced off. When the demand exists for the system, then you take away the fence and you have the spatial requirements and so on. So this is introducing the idea of transformative urbanism. I give you another idea. Let's say that the patch on the lower left, the red one, is an area of recycling of material. Why? Because in many informal settlements, you recycle the waste. La spaziatura è riciclata. So what happens if we organize a formal recycling center to extract materials and with technical assistance allow to occupy a first patch adjacent to the existing settlement? Over time, the settlement becomes to consolidate. They go up in income, in aspirations. They don't recycle material. You pass the recycling patch to a new frontier to the right, and then you have the land with the community to decide what type of community service. But if you're not using it in the transition for uses that are relevant to the community, you would never have the space to provide the services you want. Next, please. And finally, here you have the receptor camps, the land that is made available for the community to safely, legally self-construct without the fear of being on unsafe area or without the fear of being evicted. And here, this can happen many ways. The community can do it spontaneously, as they've always done. Like here on the right, you see an image that is all in it's all squared. This is in Bogota, and this happens in the grid because in Bogota, you operate with private developers. Or you can do it with the design of of the framework, as you see in the image above. So there could be different levels of design in the bigger system and also in the patches. Next, please. Next. Finally, we come to the stewards. Now, go back one, please. Go back to the puntinis. This is an example. They can occur anywhere, but you see in the image on the right, these are the park libraries in Medellin. They're very beautiful institutions, public libraries that act as custodians, that take care of the open space, and nobody would dare invade these areas. So how and which are the institutions that are loved and respected by the community that serve as these custodians, as these guardians, and help the transformation of these different components? That will depend of every country, of every city. Let's go, please. And then the idea is that all these systems of the patches, the corridors, and the custodians work in an interrelated way, in a network, in una rete, and what they're creating is a very robust urban ecology. Next. Okay, so for this system to work and to reduce social inequalities and address environmental issues, well, there are some fundamental conditions. One, there has to be political engagement. The politicians have to understand that this is important, because if you have no action, there's a serious social and political price to pay in the future. Second, you have to assemble public land. If you don't assemble public land and make it a priority, there's no way to counteract the negative exclusionary effect of the real estate-driven urbanism. And then, of course, you need the capacity of those, let's say, facilitators of this process that are young people like you in the audience that handles aspects of urbanism, landscape architecture, engineering, but they also have the ability to communicate with the people, to be facilitators. And these are very important skills. You have to create almost Martians that can think at multi-levels in this interdisciplinary work and be a liaison between the community, the politicians, and the designers and other urban actors. Next, please. Okay, so now I will try to illustrate how these ideas play out in two different contexts. Next, please. Yes. This is a multi-scalar vision for the coastline of the Caribbean of Colombia. It's about 200 kilometers. In this image, this is a montage, and you see some buildings in Dubai, whatever, but this is what's going to happen in the Colombian coastline. Rich, formal, tourist-oriented urban development at the edge of the coastline. We need a medium to work here because all this that is happening is ignoring sea level rise and climate change and pushing the informal settlements, destroying the habitats to the rear. And of course, the habitats are destroyed, the streams are polluted, and all the polluted waters are going to the coast, which is the economic driver of the real estate. Next. Next, please. Okay, in this image, no, go back one. In this image on the left, you can see a speculation of how the area will accommodate 3.5 million people in only 20 to 25 years. The dark area in brown shows what I showed before, the thermal urbanism, and pushing the formal and the informal behind, but ignoring completely the environmental systems. We go back to medium. In the image in the middle, what you see is that we have mapped all the environmental systems and these streams. These are the Besos rivers of La Costa that relate the ecology of the mountain inland with the coast. And then there's a transportation system, which is that white line that you hardly can see in the image, which allows to densify the communities. If you project this, if you map the environmental systems, and you understand that for this system to survive, you have to combine urban development and the protection of the environmental systems, we're going in a better direction. I would like to show, and not to go into a lot of detail, this little dot at the lower area. It looks like a lagoon. Let's go, please. This is the lagoon of the marsh of Cartagena. The red dot is the historic district of Cartagena that is very beautiful, very well preserved, but it's meant essentially for tourism. And then you have the high-rise hotels in the peninsula. But all the rest of the city is informal, as you see in the image of the right. What do you see in the image in the center? The blue. It's the areas that are expected to be flooded with only 1 meter of sea level rise in the next 25 to 30 years. These areas, the effect of sea level rise is much stronger. And as you see, it even affects the hotels and the historic districts. Now, what do you see in the image on the right? You see these striations in the lower area. They're all informal areas, like you see the one in the lower right, that have built their homes by filling with garbage and old tires, the marsh. So they are at sea level. And in normal rainy season, they flood 50 centimeters. In hurricane season, they flood 2 meters. So what do we know that it's going to happen if nothing is done? That another 1 million people in informal settlements are going to occupy the rest of the marsh, destroying the mangroves, not only harming the ecology, but being in high risk in the near future. So what can you do? Next, please. Well, we start working with the communities now, knowing that in 15 years they'll be underwater, but you try to reduce the impact of the flood, like Medium has suggested, with different tools. Go ahead. Go ahead, please. But eventually, or at the same time, one more image, please. We capture land, public land, as we see here at the right, in order to facilitate the self-constructed process. If we don't capture the land to incite to help the informal settlements, this population will be at the marsh. So this is the other interesting thing is that all the area that you see here in dark green, what we're suggesting is to carve, to create new canals to facilitate the intrusion of water. And this does two things: establishes a precise limit between dry land and humid land, but it also allows for the migration of the mangroves. It accelerates the reproduction of the mangrove, improving the environmental condition of the marsh. So again, we're working with don't come here, but go there. This avoid, and we have tools to avoid it, and we open a frontier of urbanization, and we create this urban armature, in this case, a botanical armature, as you see on the right. Next, please. Next. This is similar in the other side of the marsh in Barcelona, in Cartagena. Here you see the existing airport that blocked the canal, that destroyed the mangroves. We know that the airport will be underwater in only 20 years. An airport, of course, that is essential for the tourist activity of this city. There are already locations appropriate to place the new airport. When the airport is moved out, then we have this land, and through a cut-fill operation, we can do the same thing. We increase the ecology of the marsh, and we have higher ground to develop areas for the lower income communities, and in this case also for the higher income real estate that allows to subsidize the operation. Next, please. And finally, I would like to finish with this new example in a very different context. This is in the city of Guatemala, in a mountainous area, inland. Let's go, please. And here, typical in Latin America, highly divided societies, but this is a typical, this could be in Naples. This could be in the periphery of any city. It is a patchwork of development in which the environmental systems are being eroded, in which the agriculture, the rich agricultural land is being eroded, in which the streams are being polluted. And here you have a combination that you see on the left, practically is all informal urbanism, and then you have patches of industrial activity, and then you have patches of real estate, middle-class, gated communities that never communicate. Now, we discover opportunities. You see this huge land in the middle that is free of urbanization. The reason that it's free is that it is a government-owned agricultural school with very low agricultural production, but the land already belongs to the city. We don't have to expropriate, we don't have to negotiate with the private sector. We can use it intelligently. How can we use it? I showed some examples. Next, please. You see the land at the middle of a larger vision, again, dealing with the environmental systems. Where do we protect? Where we can urbanize? How we can create an integrated system? Let's focus on this land that I mentioned before, on the agricultural school. Next image, please. So here we have the agricultural school that allows to, A, enhance and do better and sustainable agriculture, deal with the runoff of the nutrients of the fertilizer of the agriculture in this ecological corridor. We can create these bands of civic activity that link the lower income communities on the left with the higher income communities on the right. This line that you see here is the only existing road. We know that this area is going to have 500,000 people in the next 10 years. There's no public transportation. There is a proposal of the BRT system. The BRT bus system allows to re-densify the corridor that you see there in red, and so on. These are the main strategies. Next. And then, obviously, here in this image, you see how the agricultural land is protected, how the habitat is protected, how you have these civic staples that connect, and how the urbanism is designed to combine the agriculture, the habitat, the recreation, and the different income groups. Sometimes we focus in the more detailed design of what these civic recreational armatures are. Next. Sometimes this is a typical example of how you're pre-designing the self-constructed community. You're identifying the areas for public space, for communal gardens in the public space or community gardens in the interior courts. You're designing the lots and you're giving the prototype of how the houses can be built, beginning from an initial shell, and could be expanded. And if the community wants to do whatever they want in the house, they do it great, because they have the framework of public spaces, of environmental systems, of infrastructure, which is what they never produce on their own. Next. And then we can go into details of the type of agriculture, community organization, and whatever, and so on. So to wrap up, it is something that we should have as a norm, but it's always good to know that the ultimate goal of what we're doing is to improve the quality of life of the majority of the population, that this can only be done if we have interdisciplinary work working at different scales, and that as we design, as my colleagues explains in both their presentation, we're trying to address the spatial morphological aspects of design, but also with the ecological and socio-economic and political processes that they sustain and how they work as a system. And finally, while these general concepts can apply in any reality, the response has to be unique, has to be site-specific. Thank you very much, and sorry about the technical problems, but that gave it a little more emotion.